A Hell's Angel asked a black elderly woman why she never leaves her home. He expected anger. He got something far more powerful. Her response broke him. He came to say sorry for what he did years ago. But when she opened that door, she didn't see a criminal. She saw a soul that still had a chance. Inside that old house, he finds a woman who hasn't stepped outside in 15 years, and a secret that ties their lives together in ways he never imagined. As the walls between them start to fall, danger from his past comes roaring back. Now one broken man and one grieving mother must face the pain that's kept them both prisoners. What happens when the man who destroyed her peace becomes the one person who can save her faith? And will forgiveness really set them free, or break them both all over again? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The sun hung low over the highway, turning the sky the color of rusted copper. A lone motorcycle rumbled across the cracked asphalt, its engine growling like thunder rolling over empty land. The rider, a tall man with tattoos climbing his arms, slowed down when he saw the crooked wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Marigold Springs, a quiet place to call home." He snorted at the words. Quiet place. Maybe that's what he needed. Quiet. Something he hadn't felt in years. Luke Warner, though most folks once called him Crash, pulled off the road near a half-forgotten gas station. He parked his Harley beside the rusted pump and wiped the sweat from his brow. The August heat wrapped around him like a heavy coat. His leather vest clung to his back, and the road dust painted his boots brown. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His parole slip. Fresh ink. Fresh chance. Inside the station, an old man behind the counter barely looked up from his newspaper. "Need gas?" he asked without smiling. Luke nodded. "And maybe directions. I'm looking for somewhere to stay a while." The man gave him a long look, one that said, "We don't get your kind around here often." "There's a motor court down by the bridge, cash only. Don't cause trouble." Luke gave a half smile. "Not my plan." But even as he said it, he knew plans didn't always matter. Trouble had a way of finding him. That night, Luke rode until the lights of Marigold Springs faded into soft pinpricks in the distance. He found a patch of land near the woods and made a small fire. The night was quiet, except for the hum of cicadas. He leaned back against his bike, staring at the stars, thinking about the men he used to call brothers, the ones who wore leather vests like his, marked with skulls and flames. The Hells Angels had been his family for 10 long, broken years. He had left them after the bar fight that sent him to prison. One man nearly died that night. Luke still saw the man's face when he closed his eyes. Sometimes he saw his own face, too, full of rage and emptiness. He didn't know what forgiveness felt like, only the ache of wanting it. When the fire burned low, he noticed something out beyond the trees. A faded white wall stood at the edge of a dirt road, covered in graffiti. He squinted, and his stomach tightened. One of the words painted there was one he remembered too well, an ugly, hateful word he'd helped spray years ago when he and the gang tore through this town. It was the same wall, the same house. He could almost hear the laughter of the men beside him that night, the roar of engines, the sound of glass breaking. He had been drunk, wild, and stupid. He remembered a woman's scream behind that door. He thought she'd probably moved away by now. But what if she hadn't? A knot formed in his chest. He couldn't drive off. Not this time. When the dawn came, soft and pink, he stood up, brushed off his jeans, and started walking toward the house. The old Victorian looked like time itself had forgotten it. The paint peeled in long curls, and ivy crawled up one side of the porch. The yard was a jungle of tall grass and fallen branches. A wooden "Keep Out" sign hung crooked on the fence, but Luke ignored it. He walked up the creaking steps and raised his hand to knock. For a long moment, nothing happened. The house was still. Too still. He was about to leave when he heard the faint sound of a cane tapping the floor. The door cracked open. A small, elderly woman stood there, framed by the shadows of her hallway. Her silver hair was wrapped in a scarf, and her face was lined but strong. Her dark eyes locked on his tattoos, his boots, his leather vest. Luke tried to speak but couldn't. The words stuck. "Finally," she said softly. "You boys never knew what that word did to me." Her voice wasn't angry. It was heavy, like a prayer that had been said too many times. Luke swallowed. "Ma'am, I'm not with them anymore." "I know who you are," she replied, though her eyes softened just a little. "You were one of the young ones, always laughing, always angry at something." He looked down, ashamed. "I came to make it right." "You can't paint over pain," she said quietly. But then something surprising happened. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "But you can start by repainting that fence." Luke blinked. "You're letting me?" "I'm letting you try," she said. "Come back tomorrow. Bring your own brush." Then she closed the door. The next morning, Luke showed up early with a bucket of white paint and an old brush he found at the gas station. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. He worked without stopping, wiping sweat from his forehead, careful with each stroke. From inside the house, the old woman watched him through the window. He caught her reflection once, a small figure behind lace curtains, sipping something from a mug. By noon, the fence shone, bright and new again. He set the brush down and knocked once more. The door opened, and she said, "You work fast." "I owed it to you," Luke said. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "You look like you need some water, maybe some tea." Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and old cedar. Framed photos lined the hallway, smiling faces, church groups, a young man in a suit holding a Bible. The woman poured him sweet tea into a chipped floral cup and handed it to him with both hands. He tried not to shake as he took it. "Thank you, ma'am." She sat opposite him at a small kitchen table, her cane resting nearby. "You got a name?" "Luke," he said quietly. "Most folks used to call me Crash." "I'll stick with Luke," she replied. "Names matter." They sat in silence for a while, the old clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Luke said, "I didn't expect you to let me in." "I didn't expect you to come back," she said with a small shrug. "But I reckon we both surprised ourselves today." Something about her calm voice made Luke's chest ache. She didn't know it, but he hadn't sat down with another human being in months without feeling like a storm inside. When he left that afternoon, she followed him to the porch. "Luke," she said before he climbed on his bike. "Kindness tests a soul more than anger does. You remember that?" He nodded, unsure what she meant, but the words stayed with him long after he rode away. That night, Luke sat by the motel window, staring at the old house across the hill. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn there, as if fixing that fence had fixed a tiny piece of himself. The next morning, he woke early again and rode back. The woman didn't seem surprised this time. "I figured you'd show up," she said, opening the door before he even knocked. "The yard's a mess. I'd appreciate a man who knows his way around a mower." He laughed, a rough sound that startled even him. "Yes, ma'am." By noon, he'd cut the grass, cleared the weeds, and mended a broken porch step. He didn't talk much, but the rhythm of the work soothed him. When he looked up, she was sitting on the porch with her Bible in her lap, smiling faintly. "You ever read this book?" she asked. He wiped his hands. "Once. Didn't understand much of it." "That's all right," she said. "You start by listening before reading." Luke nodded. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as an ex-con or a sinner, but as a man who might still have some worth left. When the sun set, Luke lingered on the porch steps. "You never did tell me your name," he said. She looked at him with soft eyes. "Ruth. Mrs. Ruth Henderson." He smiled slightly. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Henderson." She chuckled. "Took you long enough?" He rode away just as the porch light flickered on behind him. For the first time in a long while, the road ahead didn't feel empty. And though he didn't yet understand why, he knew that old house, and the woman inside it, were about to change everything. Morning light slipped over the hills like a soft blanket. Dew clung to the tall grass as tiny beads of glass. Luke rode back to the old house with the same steady rumble as yesterday, but his chest felt different. Lighter. He had slept a few hours at the motor court, boots still on, head full of porch boards and fresh paint. The sun had barely climbed when he cut the engine and listened to the cool quiet of the street. A bird called from the elm tree. Somewhere, a dog barked twice, and then stopped. He walked up the path, careful not to crush the wild violets tucked near the steps. The door opened before he reached it. Mrs. Ruth Henderson stood there with her cane, and a small smile that warmed the doorway like a lamp. "I knew you'd come," she said. "I said I would," he replied. "You told me to bring my own brush." She looked past his shoulder and nodded at the bucket he carried. "I also see you brought paint and a rake. A man who plans ahead is a rare gift." He set the tools down near the porch. "I figured the fence could use a second coat. And the yard, it wants help." "Yards do not want anything," she said, amused. "But people do. Come inside for a moment. There's tea on the stove. I'll not have a man working hungry in my yard." He followed her into the kitchen, breathing in the lemon scent and the hint of cinnamon that seemed to live in the walls. Sunlight fell in broad rectangles across the old linoleum. She poured sweet tea into 2 mismatched cups, one with a chip and tiny roses, the other plain and green. She sat across from him and folded her hands, watching him as if listening for a second voice. "Thank you," he said. He took a sip. Cold. Sweet. He had not tasted anything that gentle in a long time. "I need you to hear me," she said, voice low but clear. "I do not need your money. I do not need pity. If you work here, it is not because I can't. It is because there's work to be done and your hands are here." He met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She tapped the cane lightly on the floor. "Now tell me why you came back." Luke looked down at the cup. The green glaze had a hairline crack. He traced it with his thumb. "I came to say sorry," he said at last. "For the wall, for the word, for the noise, for being the kind of man who didn't care what damage he left behind." She did not shift. She did not blink away. "Are you that kind of man still?" He shook his head once. "I don't want to be." "Then get to work," she said, but her tone was soft. "And while you work, think about the difference between paint and repentance. Paint covers. Repentance changes." Luke stood and picked up his brush. "Yes, ma'am." He stepped back into the brightness of the yard, the heat rising now from the earth. He stirred the paint and began, with slow strokes along the fence. White washed over gray. Each stroke took care. He kept the line smooth, even on the warped boards. He worked the way a man prays who has no words. He breathed with the motion. Dip, drag, lift, dip, drag, lift. Across the street, a screen door creaked. A woman in a floral housecoat paused to stare at him, then pretended to water a pot with no plant in it. A pickup rolled by, slow and curious, then continued on. Luke felt their eyes but did not look up. He had known eyes his whole life, judging, daring, doubting. He felt the weight of them, but the brush kept moving. By mid-morning, sweat ran down his temples and soaked the collar of his shirt. He stopped, wiped his face with a rag, and turned to the brick wall by the side yard. The old slur still shouted there, even faded by years and rain. It sat like a bruise on the home. He stared at it a long time, throat tight. He carried the bucket over and set it down. He did not ask for permission. He did not need it. He dipped the brush and pulled a hard line of white over the first letter. The bristles dragged slow as if pushing through mud. He went again, thicker, then again. He did not rush and did not break the rhythm until the last mark vanished under clean paint. When it was done, he took a step back. The wall looked new in that one place, and the rest of the house seemed to stand a little taller beside it, as if it had drawn breath. "Would you like a sandwich?" Ruth's voice drifted from the porch. She had watched quietly, hands folded over her Bible, a soft pride in her eyes she did not name. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and leaned the brush to rest. They ate on the porch steps, peanut butter and honey on wheat bread, paper napkins tucked under their cups. The shade felt kind. He said little. She said less. The elm leaves whispered and threw dappled shadows on their shoes. After a while, he cleared his throat. "I was drunk that night," he said. "That's not an excuse. It's a fact. I remember the guys yelling. I remember laughter that didn't sound like mine. I remember someone screaming from inside the house. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself nobody got hurt by paint and noise." Ruth looked at him, and the lines around her mouth deepened with thought. "Sometimes the loudest hurts leave no blood," she said. "You know that now. You did not know it then." He nodded. "I wish I could take it all back." "Wishing is a good start," she said. "Working is better. Keep going." So he did. He finished the wall, and then moved to the back fence where vines had strangled the boards. He pulled vines by the handful, careful to keep the roots from tearing up the garden edge. He trimmed branches that leaned too low over the roof. He cleaned the gutter, holding on with one hand while scooping with the other. He found a lost baseball in there, chipped and gray, and set it on the porch rail like a small trophy. The sun pressed down, hard as noon passed. Sweat stung his eyes. His arms trembled with the steady labor. He felt good. When the hardest heat broke, he took the rake and groomed the yard into neat rows of grass. The smell of cut green rose up like a hymn. He raked and bagged until the lawn looked like someone loved it again. He did not talk to the neighbors who slowed their cars. He did not call out to the boys on bikes who lingered at the corner, daring each other to come closer, and then speeding off with squeals of laughter. He had nothing to prove to them. His proof was in the work. In the late afternoon, the sky shifted from hot blue to a gentler shade. Ruth came down the steps, holding 2 glass jars of water clinking with ice. She moved carefully, cane tapping, but her face was bright. "This yard is a sight," she said. "You gave it back its shape." Luke took the jar and drank deep. The water tasted like the word mercy. "Didn't think I remembered how to do this much," he said. "You did not forget," she said. "You were just using your hands for the wrong things." She glanced at the clean wall and then at the fresh fence. "There is one more thing, though. That step there." She pointed with her cane to the top stair, where the board dipped low in the middle. "It's not safe. I have learned enough about falling. I'll fix it before I go, he said. He found the loose nails, old and bent. He pried them out. He cut a brace from a spare board in the shed. Something had told him to check there earlier, and the shed had offered just enough. Then set it firm, and hammered new nails in steady blows. He pressed his weight on the step. It held. He pressed harder, solid. May I ask you something? Ruth said, watching him test the step again. He glanced up. You can ask me anything. Do you believe a person can change? He swallowed. His hands were still on the wood. I want to, he said. But wanting is not the same as believing. She nodded like she had expected that answer. Then keep wanting and keep doing. Belief is often something that grows while your hands are busy. He looked down at his palms, rough and nicked, and almost smiled. As the sun dipped lower, Ruth invited him back inside. The air had cooled, and the kitchen window held a square of orange light. She set a pot on the stove and stirred a soup that smelled of chicken and thyme. He washed his hands at the sink, staring at the window glass fogging with steam. The water ran brown from the dust and paint. He scrubbed until his fingers felt new. This is more than I deserve, he said when she handed him a bowl. Deserve has nothing to do with soup, she replied. Hunger does. They ate at the table, and this time the silence wasn't heavy. It sat between them like a full basket. He noticed the small things then. The hand-sewn pot holder with crooked stitches, the little ceramic rooster on the sill, the calendar from 3 years ago still, hanging straight. He noticed a photograph on the counter. Ruth in a bright dress, standing beside a younger man in a suit, both smiling as if the sun shone just for them. He did not ask about the man. The question rose in his throat and then rested there, quiet for now. He sensed a door he should not open yet. After they finished, Luke carried his bowl to the sink without being told and washed both dishes. When he turned, Ruth had moved to the hallway and stood by a table with a small box on it. She opened it and took out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. I've kept this by the door, she said, for a long time. She handed it to him. Open it. He unfolded the paper. It was a simple list written in a neat hand. At the top, the title read, Things to Do When I Step Outside Again. The list held everyday tasks. Buy fresh peaches, take flowers to the churchyard, feel sunlight on my face, look at the river water from the bridge, wave at Mrs. Greeley, sit in the square and just be. He looked up, unsure if he should speak. I wrote that after the first year, she said, and then the second. And then I stopped writing. I did not stop wanting. I just stopped believing. Her eyes were bright now, but steady. I am not asking you to fix me. I am telling you what is true. I kept the list to remember that my life had a shape beyond these walls. Luke folded the paper carefully and gave it back. You'll do these things, he said before he knew he would say it. Maybe not all at once, but you will. She took the paper and slipped it back into the box. Maybe, she said, but her mouth tilted at the corner. Maybe. Evening drifted in. The kitchen dimmed until the porch light clicked on with a soft hum. Luke stood, feeling the tug of the road and the ache of work done right. He moved toward the door and then paused. There's one more thing I need to say, he murmured, staring at his boots. When I was with the gang, I did a lot of damage in a lot of places. I told myself no one really got hurt. But you said something yesterday, and I can't stop hearing it. Kindness tests a soul more than anger does. I want to try and pass that test. Ruth stepped closer, Kane resting against the doorframe. You already began, she said. Tests do not end in one day. They are long. God is patient. He He nodded, a tightness loosening in his chest. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "There's still the back porch to sand. And I noticed the swing chain is rusted. I can fix that." "Bring oil and a new chain," she said. "There is coffee at 7. I make it strong enough to wake the dead." He laughed, and the sound surprised them both. On the porch, he looked over the yard one last time. The fence stood bright and straight. The wall was white and quiet. The step was firm. He could smell the cut grass even now, clean and green in the drop of evening. Somewhere down the street, a radio played a slow gospel tune. As he climbed onto his bike, he spotted a scrap of paper jammed under the rubber strap near the seat. He pulled it free and read the scrawled words, "You're being watched, traitor." He felt the old fear kick in his ribs. The night around him seemed to lean closer. For a second, the calm he had gathered all day flickered like a thin candle. He closed his fist around the note and looked back at the open doorway. Ruth stood there, framed by warm light, one hand on the door and one hand on her cane. She didn't know about the note. She didn't need to, not tonight. He tucked the paper deep into his pocket, started the engine, and gave her a small nod. She lifted her hand in return, palm open, as if blessing the road beneath his wheels. The bike rolled into the violet dusk. Fireflies began to spark in the hedges. He rode slow past the square, past the gas station, past the bridge where the river whispered in the dark. The motor court sign blinked in a tired rhythm, and he pulled in, parked, and sat still for a long moment with the engine off and the ticking of metal cooling like a clock counting breaths. Inside the tiny room, he set his tools by the door and washed the paint from his arms. He laid the crumpled note on the nightstand and stared at it until his eyes blurred. Then he picked it up, tore it once, tore it again, and dropped the pieces into the trash. He lay down on the bed without turning off the lamp, hands folded on his chest, and thought of a list by a door, of peaches and sunlight and a bridge. He pictured an old woman's smile and a yard that looked loved. Sleep came slow but steady. Outside, the night kept its watch. Somewhere in his dreams, the sound of a brush on wood matched the beat of his heart, and the white paint covered the old word again and again until the silence felt clean. He woke once before dawn to the soft patter of rain and the faint scent of cut grass rising through the open window. He closed his eyes and rested in the small mercy of that smell. When morning came, he would go back with oil and chain, with coffee waiting and work to do. He didn't know it yet, but the questions he feared most were waiting too, quiet and patient as the light that would pour through her kitchen window. For now, the road held still, and the town slept, and the porch light at the old house glowed like a star that refused to quit. Rain tapped softly against the window of Luke's motel room, steady as a heartbeat. Dawn light crept through thin curtains, turning the gray morning pale and soft. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, lacing his boots. His hands were rough and scarred, but they moved with purpose now. The crumpled note from the night before, "You're being watched, traitor," lay torn in the trash can. He stared at it for a long moment, then shook his head and stood. Whatever ghosts from his past wanted to follow him, they'd have to find him in the daylight. He grabbed his jacket and helmet, stepped outside, and breathed in the scent of wet asphalt and damp pine. For the first time in years, the air felt like it had something clean in it. By the time Luke reached Mrs. Henderson's house, the rain had slowed to a mist. The sky hung low, the clouds streaked like smoke. He parked his motorcycle by the fence, now bright white against the gray morning, and knocked gently. The door opened a few inches, and Ruth peered out with that same calm, careful gaze. Her silver hair was tied back in a soft scarf, and she wore a cardigan buttoned all the way to the top. "You're early," she said. Luke shrugged, smiling a little. "Couldn't sleep much. Figured I'd start on that porch swing before the weather turns." She opened the door wider. "Coffee's on. Go fetch yourself a cup before you start." He followed her inside. The house smelled of cinnamon again, mixed with something else. Wood polish, maybe, and thyme. The kitchen was small but tidy, every object in its place. A kettle sat on the stove, still steaming. She handed him a chipped mug and poured coffee dark as molasses. He took a sip, grimacing and then chuckling. "You weren't kidding. This could wake the dead?" Ruth smiled softly. "Good. Then maybe it'll keep you from joining them." They sat for a moment in quiet. The rain brushed against the window like a whispered hymn. Luke wanted to ask about the note, about whether she ever felt unsafe, but the question that came out instead was, "You ever go outside much anymore?" Ruth's hands, which had been steady on her mug, paused. She looked at him with those deep, thoughtful eyes. "Not in 15 years, she said simply. He blinked. 15? She nodded. "Last time I stepped off that porch was the day they buried my boy." The air seemed to still around them. Luke waited, but she didn't look away. Her voice didn't shake either. It was quiet and strong, like someone telling a story that had become a prayer. "He was a good man, preached at the church down on Maple Street, talked about peace more than anything else." Her eyes drifted to the window. "One night, he stayed late to lock up after service. Some boys drove by shouting things they didn't understand. My son went out to tell them to go home. He didn't come back in." Luke felt the blood drain from his face, his fingers clenched around the mug, the ceramic warm but unsteady in his grip. "They ever find who did it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "Doesn't matter. The law did what it could, but hate's a hard thing to trace. It moves around, finds new faces to wear." She set her mug down gently. "I forgave them years ago. I just never forgave myself." He frowned. "Why?" "Because I told him to lock up alone that night," she said. "He said, 'Mama, I'll be fine. The Lord will walk with me.' And I believed him." Luke's chest felt tight. The kitchen light flickered against the rain-streaked window, and he couldn't find the right words. What could a man like him possibly say to a woman who'd lost everything? Finally, he muttered, "I'm sorry." Ruth gave a faint smile. "You didn't do it, son." He looked down. "Maybe not that night, but I was one of those boys once, yelling things I didn't understand." She studied him for a moment, then reached across the table and touched his hand. "And yet here you are," she said, "trying to build instead of break. That counts for something." Luke swallowed hard. "You really believe that?" She nodded. "I believe God puts lost people in each other's paths for a reason." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Luke replaced the rusted swing chain with a new one, oiled the hinges, and sanded the old seat smooth. The rain stopped around noon, leaving the air heavy and damp. Birds began to sing again, and the world smelled of wet wood and earth. When Ruth came out to check on him, she brought a plate of cornbread wrapped in a towel. "Thought you could use this," she said. He took a piece and smiled. "You sure feed your workers well." "I feed my guests," she corrected. "Workers get paid. You don't." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." They sat together on the steps, watching the steam rise from the damp yard. The sky began to clear, and sunlight broke through in soft streaks, turning the wet fence into silver. Luke said, You ever think about leaving this place? Maybe living somewhere new?" Ruth's eyes drifted toward the street, where puddles glimmered like mirrors. "I used to. But then this house became the only piece of him I had left. Every nail, every creak, it's his memory. If I walk away, I lose him again." Luke nodded. Maybe staying is its own kind of courage. She gave him a long look. Maybe. Or maybe it's just fear wearing Sunday clothes. As the afternoon wore on, Luke helped her sort through a box of old letters and photographs in the parlor. Most were yellowed, the ink faded. Some showed her son, tall, smiling, standing in front of a church pulpit. Others were from community events, children's choirs, and food drives. Every photo seemed to hold a piece of joy wrapped in pain. One photograph stopped Luke cold. It showed a group of men standing beside motorcycles near a gas station, their faces blurred with time. But one of the vests bore a familiar patch, the Hells Angels emblem. He turned it over and read the writing on the back. Summer Festival, 2008. "That was the year it happened," Ruth said quietly. Luke's throat tightened. He couldn't be sure, but one of the men might have been him, back before prison, before he even knew what hate looked like up close. He set the photo down carefully, as if it might burn. "I used to think people like that couldn't change," Ruth said. Then one of them knocked on my door with paint on his hands and guilt in his eyes. He met her gaze, and something inside him steadied. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next," he said honestly. She smiled softly. "Keep showing up. Keep fixing what you can." Evening came slow and golden. Luke finished repairing the porch swing, and Ruth brought out 2 quilts to cover the seat. They sat together, swaying gently as fireflies blinked in the yard. "I used to sit here with him," she said. "He'd read scripture while I knitted. The world felt smaller then, and kinder." Luke listened to the creak of the chains, the hum of the crickets. "You ever think about sitting out here again?" "I am now," she said simply. They rocked in silence for a while. The porch light flicked on, warm against the dusk. Finally, Luke said, "You know, I think I came here to fix a fence, but maybe it's something bigger." Ruth smiled, looking out into the twilight. "Maybe you're here to mend a soul, maybe 2. The swing rocked, slow and gentle. The night wrapped around them like a blanket. For the first time, Ruth didn't glance at the street with fear, but with quiet memory, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. The morning air carried a sharp chill, the kind that whispered that autumn wasn't far off. A thin fog lay over the town, curling between the trees and rooftops. Luke parked his motorcycle near the gate and looked at the house that had already begun to feel familiar. The fence he'd painted glowed pale against the gray, and the repaired porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, creaking like it remembered voices that once filled it. He carried a toolbox up the steps, careful not to scuff the fresh boards he'd nailed last week. The front door opened before he could knock. Mrs. Ruth Henderson stood there, wearing a long sweater the color of toast and a small, knowing smile. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking about that porch roof. It's starting to sag on the left side." She chuckled softly. "You don't rest easy when something's crooked, do you?" He grinned. "Guess not. Bad habit." "Not a bad one," she said, moving aside so he could enter. "Coffee's on. Strong, the way you like it." He followed her into the kitchen, the smell of brewed coffee and biscuits wrapping around him like a warm blanket. He noticed a vase of wildflowers on the counter, tiny yellow blossoms that looked freshly picked. "You go outside for these?" he asked, surprised. Her eyes glimmered with quiet pride. "Only to the edge of the yard. It's a start." Luke smiled, setting down his tools. That's something to celebrate. Ruth shrugged, but her cheeks softened with a faint blush. Maybe, she said. But I came back in quick. Didn't want the neighbors thinking I was ready to start dancing. Luke laughed, and she joined in. A sound so light and musical it made the house seem brighter. After breakfast, Luke climbed a ladder to inspect the porch roof. Ruth stayed below, sweeping the steps and humming a gospel tune. He couldn't name the song, but the melody settled over him, soft as smoke. The boards were weathered, but fixable. He tightened a few nails, replaced a rotted beam, and straightened the gutter. Every now and then, he'd glance down and see Ruth watching him, her face calm and steady. When he finished, he climbed down, wiping dust from his hands. It's solid now, he said. Should hold through the winter. Ruth leaned on her cane and nodded. Isaiah used to do that, she said suddenly. He was always patching something up. Said he couldn't stand to see a thing fall apart if he could mend it. Luke set down his hammer, listening. He'd learned by now that when she spoke of her son, it wasn't just memory. It was prayer. He built the swing? Luke asked. Mm-hmm, she said, her gaze on the porch. With his own hands. He said every home needs a place for rest. Luke looked at the swing, the new chain gleaming in the sunlight. Then I guess I just carried on what he started. Ruth smiled faintly. Maybe you did. They spent the rest of the morning sorting boxes in Ruth's parlor. Dust floated in golden beams through the tall windows. Luke lifted one box marked Church Events, and inside were stacks of handwritten flyers, hymn sheets, and photos of smiling faces. Your son ran all this? Luke asked. Ruth nodded. He wanted to build a center, somewhere kids could learn after school, somewhere folks could eat together on Sundays. Luke flipped through the papers, careful not to bend the edges. That's a good dream. It was, she said softly. He had a way of making people believe they could be better, even the ones who didn't think they deserved it. Luke paused, the weight of her words settling in. Sounds like someone else I know. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Are you flattering an old woman now? He smiled. Just telling the truth. She laughed, but her laughter faded when she caught sight of a worn Bible tucked among the papers. The cover was cracked, the spine nearly split. She lifted it gently, brushing the dust away. This was his, she said. Isaiah never went anywhere without it. Said it wasn't the words that gave him strength. It was what they reminded him of. Luke studied her face. What's that? That God isn't finished with us yet, she whispered. She set the Bible on the table, her fingers lingering on the cover. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she looked up, her eyes softer but more distant than before. You know, Luke, she said, I've forgiven the men who took him. I had to. But I never forgave myself for letting fear keep me shut in this house afterward. He frowned. You had every right to be scared. Maybe, she said. But fear steals life one small piece at a time. You don't even notice until you're empty. Luke looked around the quiet room. The dust, the faded curtains, the silence that seemed to hum between the walls. Then maybe it's time you take some pieces back, he said gently. She smiled faintly. Maybe you're right. That afternoon, they worked outside again, side by side. Luke fixed the back gate, while Ruth watered her small patch of flowers. Every now and then, they talked. Small things, nothing heavy. She told him about the town years ago, how the church bells rang every evening and children chased each other down the road. He told her about his father, about the good days before the gangs, when they'd fix old cars together and listen to the radio. He died when I was 15, Luke said quietly. After that, I started running with whoever would have me. Thought being tough meant being safe." Ruth rested her watering can on the ground. "We all chase safety in different ways," she said. "But sometimes, the safest place is the one that scares us most." Luke thought about that as the sky turned gold with late afternoon light. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't have to. When the sun dipped lower, he noticed a dark car idling at the end of the street. The engine rumbled low, and for a moment he caught a glint of sunlight off a chrome bumper. The hairs on his neck rose. "You expecting anyone?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "No one comes by without calling." Luke wiped his hands and stepped off the porch. The car revved once, then slowly drove away. He stood there a while, watching it disappear around the corner. A familiar unease crept up his spine. When he came back to the porch, Ruth was watching him closely. "Old ghosts?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Some things don't like to stay buried." She nodded slowly, gripping her cane tighter. "Then you make sure they don't come digging around here?" "I will," he promised. That evening, they ate supper together. Fried catfish, collard greens, and cornbread. Ruth had cooked enough for an army, and Luke tried to eat his fill just to make her laugh. Afterward, she asked him to help her move a trunk from the hallway closet. Inside were Isaiah's old sermon notes, journals, and letters. She opened one and began to read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "We are all builders," he wrote. "Some build walls to keep others out. Some build bridges to cross divides. The choice is ours." She folded the letter and looked at Luke. He always said God could build a bridge between any two hearts if someone was willing to start the work. Luke felt his throat tighten. "Maybe that's why I'm here," he said softly. "Maybe I'm supposed to help you finish building that bridge." Ruth's eyes shone with quiet tears. "Then let's make sure it stands strong." By the time Luke left that night, the fog had returned, curling low across the road. He strapped his helmet on and looked back at the house. The porch light glowed through the mist, warm and steady. He started the engine, but before he rode off, he checked the mirror. The dark car was back, parked half a block away. 2 silhouettes sat inside. They didn't move. Luke stared for a moment, heart pounding, then revved the engine and rode off, the roar breaking the quiet street. As the house faded behind him, he knew one thing for sure. His past had found him again. And this time, it wasn't just his soul on the line. It was hers too. The morning broke cool and quiet. Sunlight filtered through thin mist, laying pale streaks across the hills. Luke arrived early, carrying a small wooden crate filled with seed packets and tools he'd bought at the hardware store. The sound of his boots on the porch woke the blue jays resting in the elm, and they darted into the sky, their wings flashing in the light. The front door opened, and Mrs. Henderson stood there with her sweater pulled close. "You're up with the roosters again," she said, smiling. "Couldn't sleep," Luke replied. "Thought we might start that garden you mentioned. The soil looks good after the rain." She tilted her head, her eyes glimmering with quiet curiosity. "You know how to garden, son?" "I used to," he said. "My mom planted beans and corn every spring. Said if you want to see faith in action, you plant a seed and wait." Ruth chuckled softly. "Then let's see what grows." They walked to the side yard, where the morning dew still clung to the grass. The soil was dark and soft, broken only by patches of stubborn weeds. Luke rolled up his sleeves, picked up the shovel, and pressed it into the earth. He worked slow and steady, turning the dirt in neat rows. Ruth sat nearby in a folding chair, sorting through seed packets, beans, tomatoes, collards, and marigolds for the edges. As he dug, she hummed, a melody that was gentle but strong, like something old and holy. "You sure you don't mind the work?" she asked after a while. "Work's good for me," he said, pausing to catch his breath. "Gives me less time to think about things I can't change." She murmured. "But sometimes thinking helps you see what you can." He looked at her, and she smiled faintly, tapping one seed packet against her palm. "It's not about forgetting the past, Luke. It's about not letting it plant weeds in your heart." He nodded, thinking of the dark car from the other night, the men inside watching. The thought pressed against his ribs, heavy as a bruise. But here, with the sun rising and the smell of soil rich in his hands, the world felt simple again. By midday, the garden began to take shape. Luke knelt by the edge, planting marigolds in a bright border. Ruth moved closer, stooping slowly to drop seeds into the furrows he'd made. Her hands trembled a little, but her touch was gentle and sure. "You've got good hands," she said. He laughed quietly. "They've done a lot of bad things, but maybe they can learn better ones." "They already have," she said softly. "You just haven't forgiven yourself yet." He looked up at her, caught off guard. "You make it sound easy." "Forgiveness isn't easy," she replied. "It's just necessary." He didn't answer, but her words stayed in his mind as he packed the last of the soil around the plants. When they finished, Ruth stood back to look at the garden. "It's been a long time since this house had color," she said, her voice thick with something deeper than pride. "Thank you," Luke smiled. "It's just dirt and flowers, ma'am." She shook her head. "No, son. It's hope." The next morning was Sunday. The church bells from Maple Street rang out clear across town. Ruth stood by the window, holding her cane and staring at the road. Luke had stopped by early to bring breakfast, coffee and biscuits. But when he saw her standing there, frozen by the curtains, he knew she was thinking about the same place she hadn't set foot in for 15 years. He set the biscuits down and said gently, "You thinking about going?" Her shoulders tightened. "I think about it every Sunday," she admitted. "But thinking and walking are two different things." Luke looked toward the window, too. The church steeple was just visible between the trees. "We could drive," he said softly. "You wouldn't have to go inside. We could just listen." Ruth hesitated, her lips pressed tight. Then she nodded once. "All right. But don't you go making a fuss if I change my mind halfway there." He smiled. "Deal." The ride to the church was quiet. The air smelled of cut grass and warm tar from the sun on the road. Ruth clutched her purse in her lap, eyes fixed on the passing houses. Luke drove slow, careful not to hit any bumps that might startle her. When they pulled up near the church, the parking lot was full. Families walked toward the doors, children in pressed clothes, women in hats bright as tulips. The sight made Ruth's fingers tighten around her cane. Luke parked under a shady tree and shut off the engine. "We don't have to go in," he said. "We can just sit here." Ruth nodded. Yes, let's do that." They rolled the windows down, and the sound of the choir drifted out through the open doors, a song about grace and mercy, words that felt old as the sky. Ruth closed her eyes, her hand trembling slightly on her lap. "I used to sit in that front pew," she whispered. "Every Sunday, right beside him." Luke glanced at her but said nothing. The air inside the truck felt sacred somehow, as if silence itself had bowed its head. When the song ended, Ruth opened her eyes again. They were wet but steady. "It's enough for now," she said softly. "Just hearing it?" Luke nodded. "One step at a time." She smiled faintly. "You sound like my pastor used to. Always telling me to walk by faith. Maybe he was right, Luke said. Even a short walk counts. She chuckled softly. You're learning faster than most. After church, they stopped by a small roadside diner. Ruth ordered fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Luke got the same. They sat by the window, the scent of grease and biscuits hanging warm in the air. For the first time, Ruth seemed relaxed in public. Still quiet, but not hiding. The waitress, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled at them. Haven't seen you out in years, Miss Ruth, she said. It's good to see you. Ruth smiled shyly. Good to be seen, honey. When the waitress left, Ruth stirred her iced tea. This town remembers too much, she said. Maybe remembering's not bad, Luke said, as long as it doesn't chain you. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've got some preacher in you, son. He grinned. Maybe it's catching. That afternoon, they drove home, the sun dipping low behind the hills. The church bells rang again, soft and distant. Ruth leaned back in her seat, humming quietly. Luke glanced at her and saw something he hadn't before. A lightness, small but real. When they reached her house, she turned to him and said, You keep coming back, don't you? He smiled. As long as you'll let me. She nodded. Then come tomorrow. There's still work to do. He tilted his head. What kind? She smiled. Work that feeds more than the belly. He didn't know what she meant, but he'd find out soon enough. That night, as Luke rode back to the motel, he thought about the day. The dirt under his nails, the sound of the choir, the way Ruth's eyes had brightened just for a moment. He thought about the garden they'd planted, seeds hidden beneath the soil, waiting for sunlight and time. Something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a kid, kneeling beside his mother's small vegetable patch. Hope. Not loud or certain, but steady, like roots growing in the dark. He didn't see the two men in the dark car parked at the corner when he passed. He didn't see the way they watched him ride off into the dusk. He just knew that tomorrow he'd be back at that little White House again, because somewhere between the soil and the songs, he'd found the one thing his soul had been missing. A reason to keep showing up. The next morning came with the smell of rain still clinging to the air. The clouds had lifted, leaving behind a soft, silver sky. Luke parked his motorcycle by the fence, and the first thing he noticed was how the little garden had begun to change already. Tiny green shoots poked through the soil like quiet promises. He crouched down, brushing his fingers over the leaves. The earth was damp and alive beneath his touch. The screen door creaked open. They grew fast, Ruth said, her voice warm with quiet pride. She stood on the porch in her shawl, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. Didn't think the good Lord would be this quick about it? Luke smiled up at her. Guess he was waiting on someone to start digging. She chuckled, tapping her cane lightly. Well, maybe we both had to get our hands dirty first. He laughed softly, standing and brushing off his jeans. Got a few more hours before the heat sets in. You want me to work on that back porch today? Go on then, she said. The boards back there haven't been touched since Isaiah's time. You'll find tools in the shed. The back porch was quiet and shaded by a big oak tree that reached high above the roofline. The boards groaned under Luke's boots, but the air smelled like cedar and rain. He found a hammer, nails, and sandpaper in the shed and went to work. The steady rhythm of hammer and wood filled the space, mixing with the sound of birds and the wind moving through leaves. As he lifted one of the loose floorboards, something caught his eye. A faded leather-bound Bible wedged between the beams. It was old, The cover cracked and edges yellowed. Luke brushed off the dust and turned it over carefully. When he opened it, a folded piece of paper fell out, tucked between the pages of Psalms. The paper was thin, worn soft at the edges, but the handwriting was neat and sure. At the top, it said, "Dear Mama." He hesitated, his pulse quickening. Inside, the ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "Dear Mama, if you're reading this, it means I left it in the Bible like I said I would. I know you worry about me when I go to the prison, but please don't. I believe those men need to hear about grace just as much as we do. There's one man here named Earl Warner. He listens harder than most. He's made mistakes, but I think he's trying. I told him God don't count us out just because the world does. If I can help even one man believe he's not lost forever, then I've done my part. I'll be home by Sunday. Save me some peach cobbler. Love, Isaiah." Luke stared at the letter until the words blurred. His chest tightened. Earl Warner. That name hit him like a blow. His father. He sank down on the porch step, the letter trembling in his hands. The world tilted a little, the air too still around him. His father, the man who had left him when he was 12, who'd gone to prison for robbery, who'd died behind bars, had been visited by Ruth's son. The pastor Isaiah had tried to save his father. And now, here he was, fixing the porch of Isaiah's mother. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a circle he didn't know how to close. He folded the letter carefully and went inside. Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table, polishing her reading glasses. When Luke stepped in, his face pale and eyes wide, she looked up immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He held out the Bible. "Found this under the porch boards. There's a letter inside." She took it gently, her hands trembling just slightly. When she saw the handwriting, her breath caught. "Isaiah," she whispered. "He must have left this right before—" She stopped, her throat tightening. Luke sat across from her, waiting. "I read it, ma'am. I shouldn't have maybe, but I did." Her eyes lifted to his. Not angry, only sad and curious. "What did it say?" He swallowed hard. "He wrote about visiting the prison, about helping some of the men there. Said there was one he talked to a lot. Earl Warner." Ruth frowned, confused. "That name means something to you?" He nodded slowly. "He was my father." For a long moment, silence filled the kitchen. The old clock on the wall ticked too loud. Ruth's mouth parted slightly, but no words came. "Your father," she repeated softly. "The man my son prayed with." Luke's voice broke as he said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't. I didn't even remember the name when I came here. But reading that—" He ran a hand over his face, shaking his head. "It's like everything I ran from keeps catching up." Ruth looked down at the Bible again, her thumb brushing the page as if tracing the memory of her son's touch. Then she looked up, her eyes glistening but calm. "Maybe it's not catching up," she said gently. "Maybe it's leading you somewhere." He let out a shaky laugh. "Feels more like it's dragging me." "Then let it," she said. "Sometimes we're dragged to where we need to be." The rest of the day moved slow. Luke fixed what he could on the porch, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. Every nail he hammered echoed like a heartbeat in his ears. Earl Warner, the man he'd hated for so long, the man who'd walked out and never looked back. And Ruth's son, the man he'd helped lead others toward grace, had seen something in Earl worth saving. When Luke came back inside later that afternoon, Ruth was still at the table with the Bible open. She had read the letter again and again, the corners soft now from her fingers. "I remember him talking about a man who wanted to write to his boy," she said quietly. "He said the man felt too ashamed to reach out. That must have been your father." Luke swallowed hard. "He never wrote me, not once." "Maybe he did," Ruth said softly. And maybe life just didn't give him the chance to send it. He sank into the chair across from her. You think God meant for us to meet? Ruth's eyes softened. I don't think there's any maybe about it. Evening settled in, golden light stretching across the kitchen floor. Luke helped Ruth prepare supper, fried potatoes and onions, and though neither spoke much, the silence felt full of meaning instead of emptiness. When they sat down to eat, Ruth said grace as she always did, her voice quiet but steady. Lord, thank you for the hands that worked today and for the lessons you hide in our finding. Amen. Luke bowed his head, his throat thick. After they finished, he gathered the dishes, but Ruth stopped him with a gentle hand. Luke, before you go, tell me about your father. He hesitated, then sighed. He wasn't always bad. He used to fix old trucks with me in the yard, but when Mama died, something in him broke. He started drinking. Then the gang got him running jobs. By the time I was 16, I was more like his lookout than his son. Ruth listened quietly, her gaze never wavering. He got caught on a job gone wrong, Luke continued. I didn't see him again until they told me he died in prison. I used to think maybe he deserved it. Now I'm not so sure. None of us deserve what mercy gives, Ruth said softly. But we still need it all the same. Luke nodded, fighting the sting in his eyes. It's strange, he said. Your son showed him grace, and now you're showing it to me. She smiled faintly. Then it looks like Isaiah's work still goes on. That night, as Luke rode back to the motel, the sky above Marigold Springs shimmered with stars. The cool wind rushed past, clearing his mind. He thought of the Bible tucked under his arm, the letter folded neatly inside. When he parked outside the motel, he sat for a long time on the edge of his bed, holding that Bible. For the first time in his life, he prayed. Not for forgiveness, not for strength, but for understanding. He whispered into the quiet, "If this is where you want me, I'm staying." And somewhere far away, as if carried on the wind, he thought he heard the faint echo of a man's voice, gentle, sure, and familiar, saying, "Build bridges, not walls." Night settled soft over the little house. Luke sat on the porch steps, the air cool against his skin, the repaired swing creaking gently behind him. Ruth stepped outside, holding 2 mugs of tea, and sat beside him without a word. For a long time, they listened to the crickets sing. Finally, Luke said, "I've done things I can't forget." His voice was low, trembling. "Fights, crimes, lies. I hurt people who never deserved it." Ruth looked at him, her eyes deep with mercy. "Then you came here to make it right," she said. "You can't undo what's been done, but you can plant something better." Tears burned his eyes as she reached for his hand. "You came here to fix a wall," she whispered. "But maybe God sent you to fix a soul." That night, the porch light glowed brighter than ever. The peace didn't last. Luke's old gang rolled into Marigold Springs, engines growling like thunder. They mocked him for going soft, for fixing fences and praying with an old woman. That night, they came back, bottles in hand, and painted the same hateful word across Ruth's wall. Luke ran out to stop them but was beaten to the ground. Ruth rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she prayed. Then her breath faltered. Her heart gave out. Sirens wailed as Luke whispered, "Stay with me." Under the porch lights, flicker. Everything he'd tried to build shattered at once. Luke sat in the hospital chapel, his hands wrapped in bandages, his heart heavier than the silence around him. Ruth lay in intensive care, fighting for her life. He wanted to run, to disappear, but her words echoed in his mind. Grace isn't earned, it's given. He bowed his head for the first time in years. "God, I don't know how to pray, he whispered, but don't let her go yet. Not like this. Outside, dawn broke across the sky. For the first time, Luke felt something stir inside him. Hope, small and trembling, but alive. When Ruth finally opened her eyes, Luke was there, his rough hand holding hers. You stayed, she whispered, weak but smiling. He nodded, tears shining. I turned myself in, he said. Told the sheriff everything. I'm done running. She squeezed his hand gently. That's how healing starts, son. Days later, Ruth returned home to find her yard filled with neighbors repainting her wall. Luke worked among them, quiet and steady. The hate was gone. In its place, bloomed peace. As the porch light flickered on that evening, Ruth smiled. Looks like God's not finished with us yet. Spring came gentle to Marigold Springs. The garden behind Ruth's house burst with color, beans climbing tall, marigolds blazing bright. Luke helped her place a wooden sign at the gate. Second chances. Children, widows, and ex-convicts all came to plant beside them. Laughter replaced the quiet that once haunted the yard. Ruth walked without her cane, sunlight warming her face, joy trembling in her smile. This is what Isaiah dreamed of, she whispered. Luke nodded, dirt on his hands. And you made it real. For the first time, Ruth didn't look back at the house, only forward. Months later, Ruth and Luke stood before a crowd in the blooming garden. A reporter asked how it all began. Luke smiled softly. I just asked her why she never left her home. Her answer broke me, but it built everything you see now. Laughter and applause filled the air as children ran between rows of flowers. Ruth looked toward her open front door, sunlight spilling through. She touched Luke's shoulder and whispered, See, son, the door was never locked. He smiled, tears in his eyes. Grace had opened it long before either of them knocked. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.